Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the international edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 8 important articles for a detailed analysis. So let's take up these topics one by one and ensure that it's a comprehensive discussion so that you don't have to go back and read your newspaper again. If you guys are benefiting from our initiatives, do support us with your likes, your comments, and without fail, subscribe to our channel. Now, before we start the discussion, we have a couple of important announcements. Today at 8 p.m., Sarmad Mehraj sir shall be conducting a special workshop to help you understand how to prepare for current affairs, how to select your optional subject, and what book list to refer for your prelims and mains preparation. So do attend the session live by using the link provided in the video description below. And also join our Telegram channel. You can use the QR code provided over here to access our Telegram channel, and also the link for the same is also provided in the video description. Because every day after the Hindu analysis, we provide a quiz based on some of these topics. So these quiz questions will help you revise these articles and prepare for the upcoming prelims examination. So without fail, subscribe to our Telegram channel as well. So with this, let's begin with today's discussion by looking at an important editorial on page number 3 of the international edition of the Hindu. This editorial is examining the current economic situation in India. It's looking at the broad macroeconomic factors, because recently the Asian Development Bank, or ADB, brought out its assessment of the Indian economy and it projected India's growth numbers. Just the other day, we spoke about Asian Development Bank. Based on this report, we understood the structure and the composition and the functions of ADB. So today, let's look at the report. What does ADB project about the Indian economy, and what are the concerns that exist for the Indian economy? So according to ADB's assessment, India's GDP numbers for the current fiscal has been increased from 6.7%, which was projected earlier, to 7%, which means the ADB is expecting India to grow at a much faster rate. This is because there has been a significant improvement in public and private investment. The government's capital expenditure has gone up significantly in the last few budgets, plus private investment and private sector participation also has improved due to the revive in consumer demand, particularly in India's rural economy. Because during the COVID-19 pandemic, for at least a couple of years, demand had subdued in the Indian economy. The reduction in demand had affected investments, but led by the government, public investments have gone up, followed by increase in private investments, and post-pandemic, there has been a clear revival of consumer demand, especially in rural areas. So this has put India on a faster growth trajectory when compared to rest of the countries. And ADB has revised India's growth projection for this fiscal year from 6.7 to 7%. So this definitely represents a positive picture for India. In fact, ADB even anticipates the Indian economy to grow at a rate of 7.2% in the next fiscal year. That is for financial year 2025-2026. So definitely there are several positive takeaways for India from ADB's report. But however, the editorial is flagging some concerns as well. Based on ADB's findings, and as well as the editorial brings out a few other aspects of the Indian economy, which have been a matter of concern, and that is exactly what we need to look at. See, if you look at India's projections, the official GDP numbers brought out by the National Statistical Office, or NSO, which functions under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. So as per these government estimates, India's growth numbers was supposed to be at 7.6% for the previous fiscal year itself. For the fiscal that recently ended on 31st March, the growth numbers projected by the National Statistical Office was at 7.6%. And for the coming fiscal, the government is expecting much higher GDP numbers. So this, in fact, has raised questions about the methodology that the government is using to project India's GDP numbers. Over the last few years, there has been criticism against India's economic data. The integrity of India's economic data has been questioned by several critics and even by few global organizations. Recently, the IMF and other top global institutions, even they provided their projections for the Indian economy. And when these findings of global organizations was misquoted by government officials and government representatives, IMF and other organizations, they countered it, saying that these are not our official numbers. Global organizations expect India to grow at a faster rate, but not as fast as what the government is projecting. Essentially, there has been a mismatch between what the government numbers are indicating and what the global organizations are indicating. So this has brought up questions on how India measures its GDP, right? It has raised questions about the methodology itself, leading to concerns about the integrity of India's economic data. Apart from that, we need to take note of the global risks that are being flagged by ADB with regard to the Indian economy. Even though Indian economy is a bright spot, because around the world there are recessionary trends which are being witnessed. In China, for example, the economy has been witnessing a downturn. Especially the housing market bubble has burst in China. It has started witnessing a deflationary trend. Across Europe, Japan, all these economies have been stagnating and decelerating. And in the United States, which is a critical market for India, inflation levels have been quite high and interest rates have been increased in order to control inflation. And that is never good news for India. Plus, we have a number of geopolitical situations going on, which could represent a big risk factor for the global economy. The pandemic had already caused a major disruption to global supply chains, and the wars that have followed, the Russia-Ukraine war, the Gaza war, and other crises events that have occurred in global geopolitics, represents a major risk for the global economy itself. And since Indian economy is directly tied to the global economic prospects, there are few risk factors which are external to the Indian economy. Domestically, even though India is doing well, domestically our demand has sustained, domestically our investments have increased as well. But the global concerns could in turn affect the Indian economy, and that is a major risk being flagged by Asian Development Bank. One big risk factor is the volatility in global oil prices. Oil prices have been significantly fluctuating ever since the pandemic. The Russia-Ukraine war caused another major disruption. Now the events taking place in the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean has raised even more concerns. I'm referring to the attacks by the Houthis of Yemen, where they have targeted commercial ships, and also the increased incidents of piracy in the Indian Ocean. So all these security risks, along with the ongoing Gaza war in West Asia, represents a major risk factor for the global economy. So these global risks are being highlighted by the ADB report, and along with that, the prevalence of high interest rate in Western countries, especially in the US, is another major risk factor for India. Because whenever interest rate remains higher in the US, or when the US Federal Reserve increases the interest rates further to contain inflation, this is bad news for developing economies like India, because all foreign capital which is invested in developing markets, they will take a flight back towards developed countries and stable economies like the US. Because if foreign investors are expecting stable and decent returns in a market like US, they would any day pull out their investments from developing nations and take the investment back to stable economies like the US. So lower interest rates in US is always good for India because that brings a flight of capital into the Indian markets. That drives up investment in our stock markets and as well as in the form of FDI. But the moment interest rates shoot up in US and Western economies, capital will take flight from developing economies like India. So this is another risk factor which could potentially cause a macroeconomic destabilization. So that is something India should be mindful of for the next 2 fiscal years, given the global risk factors that are present. Now, if you evaluate the Indian economy with regard to how the government has been handling and managing the economy, the ADB has genuinely praised some of the efforts of the Modi government, especially the high public capital expenditure, which the Modi government has been able to sustain over a few budgets, has come in for appreciation because increased budgetary allocation for capital expenditure will always create long-term assets. It helps in creating long-term assets such as improved infrastructure, from better roads to better port facilities to better industrial corridors, which can not only boost domestic demand and create jobs, but it could also boost exports from India. So public capital expenditure has significantly been increased by the Modi government over the last few budgets, and this has been appreciated by the Asian Development Bank. But however, there are some concerns as well, especially the private sector has not been proactively participating in India's growth story. Given the global risks and also a few risk factors within India, the private industry is largely holding back. Several projects have not been completed. Private investments also have been held up, especially into the startup sector in India. So the lack of private investment and the failure of the private sector to complete some of the key projects on time is still a risk factor for India. And of course, along with that, the controversy surrounding India's GDP numbers and national income data is what could hurt India's image in the eyes of the global investors and the global community, right? If India is not up to global standards when it comes to its economic data, this could hurt India's image as well, and it could potentially derail investments into India. Then another point being raised by the editorial is that the government, even though it has handled and managed the economy quite well, despite all the challenges, there is one factor which is lacking, which is the lack of structural reforms in the last 3 to 4 years. According to the Hindu, the government has not really initiated major structural reforms which were essential to create jobs in the Indian economy. I'm sure all of you would have read about these reports which say that unemployment levels in India have been quite high. Even we have discussed this, analyzed this in our previous sessions. So this is where the editorial criticizes the government for not initiating structural reforms needed to boost growth, to boost exports, and to create more jobs, given the high rate of unemployment amongst our educated youth. But however, please note that this is a one-sided view. It's a one-sided opinion of the Hindu. There can be a counter argument to this as well in defense of the government, right? But this is what the editorial is presenting. The editorial is arguing that the government has not taken up any major structural reform in the last 3 to 4 years, and this represents a risk for India. Then another concern which is being flagged, which is a very valid concern, is the low household savings in India as of now. As demand has gone up, people have spent more money instead of saving money in general. If you look at household savings data, in general, there has been a trend where discretionary spending has gone up, right? As disposable income has increased, discretionary spending has increased, but household savings has gone down. Household savings as a percentage of our GDP is at an all-time low, according to reliable data. Now, this is a matter of concern, because if savings are not adequate, this might affect investments as well. It might affect public and private investment. It could affect social security in the future for the citizens of India. So these are long-term risks which have not been addressed by the government, according to the editorial. Now, coming to the last point, the editorial is arguing that given this assessment, India should focus on promoting exports through manufacturing-led growth. The editorial is calling upon the government to invest in special economic zones, to relax the regulatory norms and provisions, and create a friendly policy environment so that manufacturing can be given a boost, not just to meet domestic demand, but also to increase exports from India. Because SEZs are primarily designed to boost the exports of the country. So the article is calling for relaxed taxation policies and regulatory norms so that industrial manufacturing can be promoted, with exports being the focus. So if export-led manufacturing growth is promoted, this would create several jobs. Lakhs of jobs could be created in the Indian economy, which in turn will create more demand. As employment numbers improve, right, the disposable income of our people will increase, and it will further boost domestic demand, and it will have a cyclical effect. But to ensure that we can push the exports, we need to strengthen our logistics. Because right now, global supply chains are under a lot of stress. The COVID-19 pandemic had already disrupted the global supply chains. Then the two major wars, Russia-Ukraine war and Gaza war, and especially the attacks by Houthis from Yemen against commercial ships, and even increased incidents of piracy by Somalian pirates. It has created a major risk factor in West Asia and the Red Sea region, on which India is critically dependent. So strengthening these routes, stabilizing the shipping lanes, and building supply chain resilience is very crucial as part of the logistics infrastructure. We should not just improve our port facilities and infrastructure, but we should also focus on stabilizing the sea lanes, which India has been doing. And along with that, we need to partner with other countries to make the supply chains resilient, to ensure that the global supply chains can withstand the impact of these disruptions. So if this is ensured, then we can boost our exports, reach other markets, and drive India's growth story. So that is what the editorial is talking about. Essentially, it's a good update on the Indian economy and the broad macroeconomic factors. Now, before I take up the next article, we have another important announcement. We have a special discount offer on our IAS courses, which is going on. And you get a flat 50% discount if you enroll for our program, along with a 6-month free extension. So those interested can contact the number which has been provided over here. Now let's look at the next column from page number 3. This is another important and interesting column that deals with India's education system. The writers are exploring the data that was brought out by a recent survey, a very popular report in the field of education called the ASER report, right? ASER stands for the Annual Status of Education Report. This is one of the most authoritative reports brought out in the field of education, especially schooling education, primary and higher schooling education. This report is periodically brought out by a non-government organization called Pratham. Pratham is an NGO which works in the field of education, and it brings out this periodic report called ASER or ASER, Annual Status of Education Report. This report was published earlier this year in mid-January. In fact, if you guys remember, we had analyzed the report in multiple sessions. But now the writers are going back to the data brought out by the report, and they are presenting some interesting arguments based on the findings of the report. It's not a repetition of what we have discussed a few months ago, because they are presenting a very new picture, a different angle to what the report has brought out. See, the findings of the report is quite disturbing, to be honest, especially with regard to learning outcomes in our schooling system. There are some serious concerns that have been raised by the findings of the report. So this has led to criticism against India's education system. It has led to criticism against the governments as well, both central and state governments, which are responsible for education in the country. And it has raised serious questions about the kind of foundational skills that we are imparting to our children in primary education and also in higher education. So the writers are saying that though the data is disturbing, it is concerning, it is better if the government and policy makers, if they don't dismiss the data. Generally, when there is criticism against the government, it's a tendency of the ruling party to dismiss those reports and defend the position of the government. But the writers are arguing that instead of being defensive, it is important to acknowledge such important data, because data is what will lead to better governance. Such data will actually give you feedback. It will generate the ground level feedback based on which you can take corrective action. You can identify the gaps that are existing in the system and accordingly carry out administrative interventions to ensure that we improve upon these parameters that have been identified by these reports. In fact, we can use ASER data in combination with other related government data. And such reliable, quantifiable data will help our policy makers, our administrators, essentially the government, to come out with better interventions to fix the deep-rooted problems in our education system. So that is what the writers are talking about. So let's see what were the findings of the ASER report. I'll just present a broad picture and let us correlate this with other official data brought out through various government surveys and through other NGO exercises. In the field of education, there are few reliable reports which can give us some important data. So let's correlate that with the findings of the ASER report. And then we can analyze how we can make use of this data in administration to plug the gaps in our education system. See, one criticism against the ASER report is that the data is very limited. It's a very narrow data that it brings out. According to the government, according to the critics of the ASER report, they say that the report is not representative of the entire nation, because the survey was conducted in just 28 rural districts in a few select schools in a large country of 1.4 billion population. Right? Out of all the states and union territories that we have, only 28 rural districts were chosen in 26 states, which means just few districts, one or two districts in every state, and within each district, few schools were selected. Now, of course, any survey, right, that too on such a scale, will never be truly representative. The writers also acknowledge this. They agree that this data may not represent the true national picture. Things could be different in other districts, in other states, or in other schools. But however, you can't dismiss the report as well. It's accepted that it's not truly representative. Yes, that is absolutely correct. Any survey, any such exercise, right? It will always rely on sampling. It will always depend on a sample which has been created, on a sample size. And you draw the data from there and you draw inferences which will help you in interpreting the data. So the writers are saying that yes, it is acceptable that this is not truly representative of the entire nation or the entire education system in the country, but definitely it's an indicator. It is giving us deep insight into grassroots education in the country, and only fools can dismiss the valuable data. Right? The writers are saying that instead of simply defending the government or simply dismissing the report, it's better to acknowledge that the report does act as an indicator. At the grassroots level, right? If not in every district, if not in every state, at least in several states, in several districts, in several schools, there are fundamental problems in our education system. To understand what these problems are, we need to look at the findings of the report. The report has pointed out that learning outcomes amongst our students is extremely poor. Foundational learning outcomes, that is with regard to basic learning or foundational concepts, which has to be imparted in primary level, at the level of class 1, class 2, this has been missing, which later creates a cascading effect as a student heads towards higher education. According to the survey, students in the age group of 14 to 18 years, basically class 8 to class 12 students, right, who are in secondary education, they do not have basic foundational skills. For example, a large number of students in this age group, right, who are in what we call as high school or secondary school, they could not even read a basic paragraph from their respective language, or even for that matter from an English textbook or from another regional language textbook. They were not able to read out an entire paragraph correctly. Right? The ability to read is something that is foundational, something that is built at the primary level. So if your high school students are not able to read one page, a single page of a textbook, and if they are not able to comprehend what they are reading, that points to fundamental problems in the education system at the primary level. And mind you, this was a class 2 textbook. The textbook given to the students to read was a class 2 textbook, and a high school student could not read a class 2 textbook properly and comprehend what the article was talking about. The same with basic mathematical skills, basic numeracy. Basic arithmetic problems, which are expected to be solved by a class 1, class 2 student, could not be solved by class 9, class 10 students. Understood? So a large number of students in secondary schools, they were not able to solve basic arithmetic problems, basic numeracy problems, which are supposed to be solved by a class 2 student. So this again indicates that the essential skills, the foundational conceptual skills that are needed are not being imparted in the right way at the primary level. So that is the reason why learning outcomes have been compromised. There is a lack of reading and basic numeracy skills, and this is something students will carry forward as they head towards higher education. This will have the potential to ruin their entire careers, right? And this is not just the finding of one report. There are other official government reports which can correlate with this data. For example, if you look at NSSO data, the National Sample Survey Office data, it points out that in our schools, attendance ratio is very poor, especially in rural areas. In rural schools, even though enrollment has increased, the government has succeeded in increasing enrollment. The number of students joining schools has gone up, but they are not able to retain them in class. Students are not coming to class. The attendance levels are in the range of 60 to 70%. So there are many factors which are responsible for the poor attendance ratio. One, the schooling system has not been able to inspire the students, right? If you have good teachers, if you have a good schooling system, right? And if the curriculum is good enough, which can instill curiosity, which can trigger your curiosity. If you have good mentors, good guides, good teachers, they can motivate the students, inspire the students to come to school and attend classes. So that could be one factor. The weak schooling system, the poor quality of teaching, the poor curriculum. So this could be one of the factors. Or there are other socio-economic factors as well. For example, poverty levels, right? Maybe parents are not able to afford sending their children to school. They initially enroll them, but they're not able to pay the fees and continue sending them. Or there is poor transportation. In remote areas, maybe students don't have adequate transportation to reach the school. Or they don't have good nutrition. Or the health of the students has been compromised due to poor healthcare and poor hygiene and nutrition. So as a result, students might be missing school, they might be missing classes, and this could be a big contributing factor, as a result of which their basic foundational skills, conceptual skills are not being built at the primary level. So when you use official government data and all the other available reports and you correlate the data, you actually get some deep insights which can be applied directly in administration, in policy making. There is another important report, the State of Elementary Education in Rural India, brought out by another NGO, which points out that in rural households, many households don't have any other books in their home apart from few basic school textbooks. Now let's say you are a student from an urban area, from a large city, you have gone to private schools, you have access to best quality education. In that case, in your house, apart from your basic textbooks issued by the school, which is in line with the respective curriculum, there will be other books that your parents should have bought for you, right? From story books to moral science books or other fictional, non-fictional books, which you might be reading. If not entirely, at least you would be glancing through them, right? At least you'll have a newspaper delivered to your house. Essentially, you have some additional reading material which is contributing to your knowledge base. But several households in India, particularly in rural areas, they do not have access to any other books. Apart from few basic school textbooks, they don't have magazines, no newspapers, and no other books are available to them. This could be a factor, right? So this is a gap which is being highlighted. We can learn from this that in several pockets of India, students don't have access to other reading material, which is essential for their development. So what can be a solution for this? How can we plug this problem? Create libraries. Community libraries can be built. So that is how you can draw insight from the data and come out with an administrative solution, right? So that is what the writers are talking about. So instead of dismissing the data or simply defending the government, it's important to correlate ASER finding with other reliable reports, identify the gaps and plug those gaps through better policies and through better administrative interventions. So we need to focus on improving attendance in our schools. It's not enough to just have high enrollment. Ensuring high attendance is very crucial throughout the academic calendar. Building foundational learning, building the right concepts, especially at the primary level, is absolutely critical. If this is missed, if this is not taken care of at the primary level, it's unlikely that students will improve in secondary and higher education. There is a direct link. What you learn in your formative years, you'll carry this forward into your adolescent years and your adulthood. If the root problems are not fixed, if your basic reading, comprehension, numeracy skills, communication skills are not addressed at the primary level, right, then it's very challenging for any student to build those skills as they proceed through the education system. So the fault is not with the student. The fault is with the system, the education system. So provide enough reading material to our students, right? Create more community libraries. Encourage career aspirations at the primary level. I'm sure you might remember your teachers would have always asked you from school, what do you want to become when you become an adult, right? What's your goal? What's your aspiration? If someone encourages that, if someone keeps reminding you that you desire to become an astronaut, you desire to become a pilot, you desire to become an IAS officer, that serves as a constant motivation for the student. But this is missing. The mentorship needed, the inspiration needed through teachers especially is missing in our primary and even secondary education system. The ASER report shows that several students in India, they express an aspiration at the initial level, especially the boy students. Majority of them say that they want to join the defense services or civil services, or they want to become a police officer, right? But girl students, usually majority of them, they say that they want to become a doctor or a teacher or an engineer. This is the trend, a pattern seen through the ASER findings. But problem is, there was no one to guide the student, to motivate the student, to inspire the student to pursue their career aspirations. So this, if it is done at the primary and secondary level, it can motivate students to attend the class. It can become a self-motivation factor. It can drive the students to do better, and which could contribute to better learning outcomes. So what they need is better mentorship, better teachers who simply don't teach the academic subjects, but go beyond that as well to motivate and inspire the students and build their career aspirations. And finally, using technology as a tool. Today, every teenager in the country will have access to smartphone, at least majority of them. The USER report has very interesting findings regarding this. The USER report says that a number of students, a vast majority of the students have access to smartphones with internet. But of course, there is a gap here as well between the boy students and the girl students. Generally, it's the boy students who have higher access to smartphones and internet compared to girl students. And also students in urban areas have more access to smartphones and internet compared to rural areas. So there is a urban-rural divide and a gender divide as well. But still, a vast majority of the students have smartphones, but the question is, are they using it for the right purpose? Usually, at this age, students will get hooked to social media platforms or games, etc. Because that is what triggers their curiosity. That is what motivates them, encourages them. But what if we can use the same platforms, the same tool for education? What if the government leverages the power of the mobile phones and the internet and pushes content, pushes education to our students so that they have other available tools for building the foundational knowledge? So these are some solutions being suggested by the writers of the column. Their basic argument is, don't dismiss the data just because it's not favorable to the government. Instead, take the findings, take the insights, correlate this with other reliable data, and based on the learning, you implement better policies, you implement better administrative measures to improve our education system. So that is what we take away from this important article. Now let's look at another important column from page number 3 that is related to environment and ecology. This article focuses on man-animal conflict or human-wildlife conflict. It's another interesting article, very important topic as well for environment and ecology, because in recent times itself, we have seen many incidents of man-animal conflict in India, and they have captured the media and internet attention because these incidents have had a huge impact in several parts of India. For example, recently in Kerala, there was an elephant which had entered into human habitation. The forest officials, along with few experts, they attempted a capture, right? They captured the elephant, they tried to relocate it and release it back into the wild. But this attempt failed as the elephant again entered another human habitation, and they made a second capture attempt, during which unfortunately the elephant was fatally injured and it lost its life. You might be aware of one more incident involving a leopard in Uttar Pradesh. A leopard had ventured into a human habitation, and immediately the authorities launched a capture operation. And usually this becomes a huge drama where the news channels rush in, the villagers come in to witness what's happening, right? And they start shouting, screaming, shooting videos, uploading it on social media, right? Which further triggers the animal, which further puts the animal under stress and trauma. And it pushes the authorities to get more aggressive in the capture attempt of the wild animal. So as they employ these aggressive methods and tactics to capture the animal, it puts the animal under a lot of stress. It's a huge risk to the animal as well because it could get injured, it could eventually lose its life as well. So this leopard also was killed following a capture operation. So there are many such horrific incidents that come out from India involving increasing incidents of man-animal conflict. So here, there are two sides to the story, right? One side argues that we need to deal with wild animals as strictly as possible because they are a threat to human beings. They threaten the local villagers. sometimes animals have entered cities and urban habitations as well, right? So they say that human life is more valuable, human life should be safeguarded, we have to aggressively deal with the wild animals. That is one side. The other side argues that it's not the animal's fault, right? It's we humans who have ventured into their habitat. It's human development, urbanization, deforestation, which has led to the crisis. We have trespassed into wild territory. Naturally, the animals are going to enter into human habitations and these incidents are going to happen, right? So those who are on the other side, they appear to dismiss the concern of the locals and villagers and the people, and they only focus on animal welfare and animal rights. So the correct solution for this with regard to conflict management as far as wildlife management is concerned lies somewhere in between the two approaches. That is exactly what the writer is talking about. The writer first criticizes the aggressive approach of the authorities to capture a wild animal. See, there are many such incidents that happen, right, frequently in India and around the world as well. Either it could be an elephant or a leopard or a tiger, snakes especially, right? Interaction with snakes is very common across India. So whenever these wild animals enter into human habitation or when they come into direct visual sight of the local communities, immediately it triggers panic. It triggers the curiosity of everyone. Everyone wants to see, they want to witness what's happening. They want to shoot videos on their mobile phones. And they want authorities to act. They want authorities to capture the animal. Right? They don't care what will happen to the animal. They don't care about finding a long-term solution, whether there is a better way of handling the conflict. They just want the animal to be captured somehow. So what do the authorities do? They'll be under a lot of pressure, especially if, let's say, the animal has caused some damage. Let's say an elephant has destroyed the crops, or it has attacked a few people, or a leopard has attacked and killed a few people, or a tiger has killed a few people. And especially when there are such casualties, when there is economic loss for the locals, they will be holding a grudge against the animal as well, and they want authorities to be more aggressive. So due to the pressure, right, which includes political pressure as well, authorities resort to aggressive tactics. The forest department officials, they'll bring in experts, veterinarians. They attempt to tranquilize the animal first, right? Either they will shoot an injection to tranquilize the animal, and eventually they'll try to physically capture it. They'll try to physically immobilize the animal, and then they try to relocate it forcefully and release it in some other habitat. This approach, even though it seems to be a solution for now, it is never a long-term solution. It only aggravates the problem. Because any such aggressive capture, it goes not just against government guidelines, it's actually unethical as well for the animal. Right? As it is argued, it is humans who have trespassed into wild habitats. It is we who have cut down forests, built cities, industries and villages in core in core wildlife areas. And when the trespass happens, we tend to overreact, expect the authorities to be aggressive in capturing the animal. That is why the writer is calling for focus on rescue, not capture. There is a difference between wildlife capture and wildlife rescue. Both are two different things. When you're just focused on capturing the animal, right, you just want to capture it somehow by any method, by tranquilizing it, by physically immobilizing it, right, by forcefully capturing it, by creating a huge drama around it, and then forcefully taking the animal, releasing it somewhere in the wild without any scientific thought behind it. Whereas a rescue will prioritize the safety, the well-being of the animal. It will focus on ensuring that the animal is treated in the right way. It's not put under any undue stress. You don't inflict any unnecessary trauma on it, both emotional and as well as physical trauma. And you don't simply take the animal, release it anywhere you want, but rather you plan the way in which the wildlife has to be managed, how the situation has to be managed. So the writer prioritizes wildlife rescue any day over wildlife capture. But see, the problem here is that though there are guidelines regarding this, it is not usually followed at the grassroots, at the ground level. According to government guidelines issued by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, that is by the central government, the guidelines say that wildlife should not be captured, right? Just because humans have sighted wildlife in human habitation. Just because an elephant has entered a village, just because a leopard has entered a suburban area, doesn't mean the authorities have to launch a capture operation, right? As long as it is not a direct threat to human lives, there is no need to capture the animal and put the animal through unnecessary trauma. Many times the trauma can become fatal. It can result in the eventual death of the animal, and there are many examples to prove that. So guidelines say that just because the animal has been sighted in a human habitation, just because there is panic and chaos, doesn't mean authorities have to intervene. Of course, they'll have to safeguard the people, but they need not capture the animal. They need not resort to any aggressive methods unless and until the animal itself is posing a direct threat. But on the ground, this is never followed. Given the chaos and panic situation created by the locals, right, and the overreaction of people in general, authorities also overreact. Right? It's become a practice that capturing the animal through any method and releasing it somewhere else is the only solution. So that is an unfortunate reality on the ground, right? So there is no consideration given to other solutions, right? Not just rescue. There are better wild animal conflict management scenarios available in wildlife management practices. There are more sustainable long-term solutions available to minimize the incidents of man-animal conflict. So that is what the writer is talking about. The writer is asking for the authorities to prioritize conflict resolution instead of just seeing this as a man versus animal standoff, right? Instead of villainizing one against the other, right? This should be approached from a conflict resolution perspective. Because see, when you, let's say, ignore the threat for humans, if you just focus on animal welfare, this ends up villainizing the humans. It will actually breed more resentment amongst the local villagers and forest dwellers. They might even react aggressively and they end up hunting and killing the animals as well. There have been incidents where wild animals would have destroyed the crops, or they would have attacked the livestock, causing economic losses to the locals. And if you don't address the issue at all, right, there are incidents where locals have taken matters into their own hands and they end up attacking the animal and killing the animal as well. So that's a scenario we would like to avoid. At the same time, you can't get extremely aggressive just because there is chaos and pressure on the ground and capture the animal and cause harm to the animal, right? In that case, the animal becomes the villain. So in either situation, in a man versus animal situation, one of them ends up becoming villainized. So the writer is saying we have to avoid this situation. We have to stop projecting this as a man versus animal situation, rather focus on conflict resolution. Focus on sustainable long-term measures, right, which certain states have done in India, which helps in reducing these incidents. See, animals might trespass into human territory. Humans will trespass into animal territory. Doesn't mean every situation should turn into a conflict, right? Doesn't mean in every situation you should go and capture the animal, right? So that is what the writer is prioritizing by keeping in mind both animal welfare, wildlife protection, and as well as safety of human beings who might be affected by these incidents. So here the writer is presenting a way forward. The writer is suggesting that first, at the level of the state government, there should be a realistic assessment of the situation. You need to identify which areas are prone for such incidents, right? Through better studies, through better collection of data, you can pinpoint certain corridors, certain areas where there have been frequent incidents of trespass from the wild towards the habited areas. Next, you can take measures to limit the entry of the animal into habited areas. Certain physical measures, certain administrative measures can be taken up, which I'm going to discuss very soon. So proactively, authorities can take few measures, and only when every other option has been exhausted, only as a last resort, a rescue operation should be considered. Capture method should be abandoned. Capture should not be the approach. Rescue operation should be adopted as a last resort, only after every other option has been exhausted. And finally, the writer says that it's important for the government to deal with this as ethically as possible. Right? We have to keep in mind the well-being of the wild animals with regard to wildlife conservation. At the same time, ensure that the impact on humans is also mitigated. So here we have one positive example, right, which is from the state of Karnataka. The writer says that Karnataka Forest Department has set a model for the country. Through certain proactive measures and long-term planning and assessment, Karnataka has been doing much better than other states when it comes to managing the man-animal conflict situation. First and foremost, the Forest Department has put in place few early warning systems, right? Either through camera traps or through better awareness amongst locals who immediately raise an alert to the concerned authorities. Instead of creating a panic situation and creating complete chaos around the situation, right? Locals have been trained. They've been made more aware, right? Regarding how sensitive they have to be towards the animals, how delicate the situation is actually. And they're trained to warn and alert the authorities so that authorities can come in and act along with the experts, ecological experts, veterinarians, right? They're brought in to help the forest authorities to rescue the animal, not capture the animal. And also rescue should be a last option, a last resort option. Along with that, the Forest Department in Karnataka regularly monitors these situations, and physical measures like fencing have been taken up in the high risk-prone areas. For example, if you look at Bandipur-Nagarhole belt in Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, this is one area where there have been frequent incidents of man-animal conflict. But adequate fencing in certain prone areas has helped in mitigating the risk along with early warning systems. Plus, other measures like better lighting during night time. Animals tend to move during night. So in some habitat areas, at least on the outskirts of the habitat areas, better lighting has been provided as well, which helps in spotting the animal, right? Through which you can ensure the safety of the humans, to ensure the animal doesn't attack the local villagers. So similarly, the animal can be simply driven away. Let's say a leopard has entered a village with the intention of attacking the livestock or the dogs, etc. Right? This can be entirely prevented. You can ensure that the animal doesn't hunt in habited areas by taking few precautionary measures, by sounding alarms, right? Or by ensuring the prey base is protected in the forest so that animal does not have to venture out for finding food. So these are basic measures that have been taken along with better waste management. Waste management, if it is very poor in these village areas and forest tribal areas, right? This could attract the wild animals outside of the forest, and this could also become a reason for incidents of man-animal conflict. So better waste management, preparing the communities, preparing them that they need not panic, they need not react violently or aggressively. Instead, they have to ensure that the animal remains calm and call in the authorities, and they will take the necessary action, right? If there is no need for intervention, they will allow the animal to pass through. Sometimes the wild animals, they don't do any harm. They simply pass through, right? You don't have to attempt a capture or a rescue just because you have sighted the animal. That's what the guidelines say as well. So in Karnataka, there has been a better implementation of these guidelines through these basic measures. These are proactive measures with focus on long-term sustainable management of wildlife. So that is the approach that should be taken according to the writer of the column. Now let's take up the last article, the last big article with regard to the means related topics. On page number 7, we have a very important update from Afghanistan. The topic is related to international relations. Recently, the Taliban government has surprised everyone with a major decision. As you know, Afghanistan has been taken over by the Taliban since 2021. The Taliban is a extremist political insurgent outfit which has been involved in terrorism, right? And it has in the past created a ground for terror activities in Afghanistan. So this extremist outfit toppled the Afghan government following the withdrawal of the American troops in 2021, and it took over the government and established an interim government in Kabul. Since then, the Taliban regime has been a concern for India and many other countries. Because in the past, Taliban had formed a government back in 1996. There was a Taliban regime in power from 96 to 2001, which was openly hostile to India. The Taliban was always seen as a puppet of Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI. And Pakistan had ensured that under the Taliban, Afghan soil was used to breed anti-India terrorist groups, to support anti-India terror outfits. So India had branded the Taliban regime as a terrorist regime. Back in 96, we had no diplomatic relations with Taliban, right? And even Taliban had cut off ties with India. It was being openly hostile to India. But now, things have been slightly different. After the Taliban captured power again in 2021, the Taliban has been craving international recognition. It wants to be recognized by the global community as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And it is especially craving recognition from a democratic country like India. And India also has opened a channel with the Taliban. Unlike the previous hostile approach where we had cut off all ties with Taliban, this time India has opened a channel with the Taliban and we are in talks with the Taliban regime. Because most other powers in the region, they had already started talking to Taliban, they had struck their own deals with Taliban to protect their interests in Afghanistan and in the region. India has major interests here, right? We have significant investments we have made, up to $3 billion worth of investments in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is crucial to connect with Central Asia, to counter terrorism. So India would need Afghanistan for all these reasons. Plus, it's very important for India, right, to ensure the safety of the religious minorities in the country. In Afghanistan, you have religious minorities like Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists. In the past, when Taliban regime had come to power, religious minorities were targeted and persecuted. Some of you might remember the visuals of the Bamiyan Buddha statues being destroyed by Taliban fighters back in 1990s, right? Even the small minority population that exists here, the minority Hindus, Sikhs and Buddhists, they have been targeted, they have been persecuted in the past. Now that is an image that Taliban wants to correct this time. As it is craving global recognition, it wants relations with India, right? India has also opened a channel of talks with the Taliban in the last couple of years. So recently it has taken a decision which has really surprised everyone, including India, and India has welcomed these changes. The Taliban regime has ordered that the properties belonging to religious minorities, the properties belonging to religious minorities like the Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, etc., these properties were previously captured by Afghan Mujahideen fighters and warlords. Over the last 20-25 years, right, few Taliban leaders, few Afghan warlords and former Afghan Mujahideen fighters, they had captured the properties of religious minorities and taken over these properties. Because minority rights were never considered by the Taliban regime. But now, the Ministry of Justice under the interim Taliban government has ordered that these properties which previously belonged to religious minorities, they have to be returned back to those families. In one particular case, a noted Afghan leader, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, he was a former Mujahideen back in the Soviet era. He later became the Prime Minister of Afghanistan as well, briefly in 1990s. And India has had a difficult relationship with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. So this Mujahideen leader, this former Afghan warlord, had occupied a property belonging to a Sikh family in Kabul. Now the Taliban government has ordered Hekmatyar to leave the property, to leave this house, to be evicted from this house, so the property can be returned back to the Sikh family. In fact, this property was owned by an individual, right, a Sikh leader in the region, who even wanted to contest elections to the Afghan parliament a few years ago. But unfortunately, he was assassinated by Islamic State terrorists. Now, this is where there is a very interesting angle to be considered. The reason why Taliban might be showing a change of heart, why it might be looking to, protect religious minorities, is because it not only wants recognition from others, particularly from India, maybe it wants help, assistance in tackling ISIS Khorasan, Islamic State Khorasan province. Of late, ISIS Khorasan has become quite notorious in Afghanistan, and Taliban has a rivalry with this outfit. Is that clear? Even though both are extremist groups, they have a rivalry between themselves. Right? They differ on their ideological goals. Taliban wants to just run a regime, an Islamic regime, right, under Sharia, but ISIS wants to establish a so-called caliphate. So there is a direct contradiction between the goals of Taliban and ISIS, which makes them rivals. So ISIS has carried out many attacks in the past against religious minorities. Just a couple of years ago, a Gurudwara in Kabul, a Sikh Gurudwara, was attacked, and religious minorities have been killed by Islamic State. So Taliban, right, which shares this rivalry with ISIS, would like assistance from others like India to counter the rise of Islamic State. India is definitely concerned about the presence of ISIS-K in Afghanistan. Its influence has spread to Central Asia as well, to Pakistan as well, right? So there could be a reason why Taliban could be reaching out to India, and that is why this decision of the Taliban regime has been a bit of a surprise. And India has welcomed the decision to return the minority properties back to their families by evicting the former warlords and Mujahideen fighters who had occupied these properties of religious minorities. So that is what we understand from this article. So now let's head towards the prelim section and take a quick look at the smaller articles. On page number 7, we have an article referring to the Forest Rights Act. It's a very important piece of legislation brought out by the then UPA government under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, which seeks to protect the rights of forest-dwelling communities. This law was enacted to protect the scheduled tribes, the forest-dwelling tribes of India, and to guarantee forest rights to them, because some of the previous environmental laws had affected the rights of the tribal communities and forest-dwelling communities. For example, Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, the Indian Forest Conservation Act, Environment Protection Act. These environment-related legislations, right, they had led to the displacement of tribal communities and forest-dwelling communities. When India started creating protected areas like national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, tiger reserves under Wildlife Protection Act, it led to the eviction of forest-dwelling tribes and these tribal communities, which compromised their rights, their forest rights. Because please understand, tribal communities, they have a symbiotic relationship with their environment. Around the world, not just in India, indigenous communities, they always respect the forest, they draw their sustenance, their livelihood from the forest, and they worship the forest as well. They do practice agriculture, hunting, collection of forest produce within the forest area, but they never harm the forest itself. Whatever they extract from the forest is usually sustainable. That's how tribal indigenous communities have always thrived, along with the environment and the nature. That's one reason why they worship the trees, the rivers, the animals, etc. That is the kind of symbiotic bond that exists between them. But this was disrupted by colonial era forest laws. Colonial era forest laws and post-independence environmental laws disrupted this bond that exists between the tribal communities and the forests. So that's why in 2006, the Forest Rights Act was enacted to guarantee a set of basic rights to our forest dwelling communities. So let's understand what kind of rights have been accorded to the tribal communities under this law. Please make a note of this. There can be a prelims question. First and foremost, title rights will be accorded to the tribal communities. Meaning, for forest dwelling tribes, if they have been residing in forest areas, that particular land, right, will be the tribals will be given ownership over the title of that property. The property will not just belong to the state, but where the forest dwelling tribe resides, up to around 4 hectares of land, right, that would be transferred to the tribal communities, to individual families that dwell and reside in forest areas. So property title will be given, title rights will be provided, which allows the communities to dwell and reside in the forest area itself. Of course, outside the core area, but at least in the buffer zone, right? Because core zone is more important for conservation efforts. But in the buffer zone, these communities can be settled and property rights can be given to them and they can reside and dwell in these areas. Next, they are given usage rights. These tribal communities, they usually collect minor forest produce. That is a basic sustenance for them. They collect fruits and berries or honey or rubber or the tobacco leaves which grows naturally in the wild, and they sell them in local markets, which is a source of sustenance for them. They don't overexploit, they only take what is needed for their sustenance. So this right was accorded, the right to use the forest to collect minor forest produce. And tribal communities, they could be pastoralists as well. They could be taking their cattle for grazing in forest land. Previously, environmental laws had prohibited this. So this right was restored. Grazing and feeding the cattle in forest areas was allowed, which guarantees usage rights to the tribal communities. Next, relief and developmental rights. This was brought in to protect forest dwelling tribes from forced eviction. This has been a concern in India's forest areas. In the name of public projects, in the name of, let's say, industrialization or large dam projects, usually tribal communities are evicted, sometimes forcefully without their consent, and the path is cleared for developmental projects. So this affects the well-being of the tribal communities. It even becomes a ground for resentment amongst the tribal communities in India. This resentment has often been exploited by extremist groups like the Naxals or the left-wing extremist outfit, the Maoist outfit. That's one reason why Maoism has been prevalent in some of the tribal belts and forested areas of India. So to ensure that justice is done to these communities, relief and developmental rights were provided through this law, which means they can't be forcefully evicted. The Gram Sabhas will be empowered to provide consent for these developmental projects. And if they have to be evicted because of a developmental project, they will have to be rehabilitated. Meaning the government should give them adequate compensation, give them alternate land where they can settle, and also provide alternate livelihood opportunities. Because these communities have no other source of sustenance, they'll have no other skills. They already have poor educational status. So it's important to safeguard them by guaranteeing these rights, and that is exactly what this law does. And finally, their community forest management right is also recognized. As I was mentioning, tribal communities play a critical role in conserving the forests because they draw their livelihood sustenance from there, they respect the forests, and they play a role in conserving the forests as well. But this right was, in a way, taken away by the environmental laws. The environmental laws gave the authority only to the government to be involved in conservation, and it had excluded the tribal communities. But now this law provided community forest management rights to the tribal communities, and as a result, they are part of the forest conservation efforts. So these are the 4 important rights accorded to forest dwelling tribes through the Forest Rights Act. So that is what you need to remember. Next, on the same page, we have another important article that refers to a strategic port in Myanmar, the Sittwe Port. So from a mapping point of view, this topic can be very important. You can expect a prelims question here. First, let me tell you why Sittwe is in news, and then I'll explain the importance of Sittwe to India. We'll also see where exactly Sittwe is located. We'll identify it on a map. According to the article, in Myanmar, the conflict has escalated between the military junta and the ethnic armed groups. And as a result, in the Rakhine state, where Sittwe is located, the ethnic armed groups they have overthrown the military, the current government in Myanmar, and these ethnic armed groups have captured this territory, which is right along India's borders with Myanmar. So here, India had a consulate. India had a diplomatic mission present at Sittwe. It's a coastal city. It's a port city. That's where India had set up a consulate. So given the increased risk in Sittwe because of the ongoing conflict and the recent capture of the region by the ethnic armed groups, India has perceived a threat for the Indian diplomats who are stationed at the consulate in Sittwe. So they have been relocated, shifted to India's mission at Yangon. India's diplomatic staff have been relocated by the Ministry of External Affairs by keeping in mind the safety of Indian diplomats. Is that clear? But Sittwe was also in news recently because India got access to operate one of the terminals at Sittwe. As I told you, Sittwe is a port location, and it is India which has invested in the development of the Sittwe Port. An Indian company has won a contract to operate and maintain the terminal at the Sittwe Port, which is part of a key project that India has been pursuing with Myanmar. That is also a reason why Sittwe is important. So let's see where Sittwe is located. If you look at the map, you can see Myanmar over here. This is the Rakhine state of Myanmar, which has also witnessed the Rohingya crisis, where Rohingya ethnic minority Muslims have been targeted by Myanmar's army and the radical Buddhists, triggering a humanitarian situation here in Rakhine. So this is where the Sittwe port is located, over here. It faces the Bay of Bengal, and it is part of a critical connectivity project pushed by India called Kaladan Multimodal Project. The Kaladan Multimodal Transit Transport Corridor. It's a key project of India that was conceived under Look East policy. Under the Look East policy, through which we have given priority for Southeast and East Asia, India conceived this project, and its construction has continued under the Act East policy, which is an upgraded version of Look East launched by the Modi government. Right? So as part of India's Look East, Act East approach, we have been pursuing this connectivity project called Kaladan project between India and Myanmar. This gives us access to Southeast Asia and also creates an alternate route to connect with Northeast India. So as part of the project, there are multiple modes of transportation involved. That's why it's called a multimodal transit transport corridor. So it includes a maritime link, a sea link through Bay of Bengal, connecting the Kolkata Haldia port with the Sittwe port in Rakhine, which has been built by India. So this sea link has been operationalized recently. India has started sending cargo as well through this shipping route. And now an Indian company is controlling and operating a terminal at Sittwe. From here, the idea is to transport the goods through Kaladan River. This project is named after this river, River Kaladan. It's a trans-boundary river. It flows from India into Myanmar. It flows down from Mizoram, which is the border state, right? So on Kaladan River, inland navigation facilities have been created. So the goods which are sent from India through a ship, through the sea route, it can be transported from Sittwe into Kaladan River through inland navigation. And finally, there is a highway which was being constructed to complete this link. So through road transportation, the goods would be brought into Mizoram. So it would not only improve connectivity between India, Myanmar and India, Southeast Asia, it would also give us an alternate route to connect with Northeast India via Mizoram. It would reduce our dependency on Siliguri corridor, which is a choke point for India. Right? Siliguri located over there, it's a choke point for India. It's called the chicken's neck of India because it's a vulnerable route. So this would create alternate route to access Northeast India and further build ties with Myanmar. So that is why the Sittwe Port is very important. Now, I'll give you one assignment. In the same region, in Rakhine state itself, right below Sittwe, hardly few kilometers from Sittwe, there is another strategic port which has been developed by China. China, which is also a major player in Myanmar, as part of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which is part of its Belt and Road Initiative. It has developed a strategic port right below the Sittwe port built by India. Now find out the name of this port and mention that in the comments below. That is the assignment for you. This strategic port built by China, operated by China, is also seen as part of its string of pearls strategy, which is designed to encircle India in the Indian Ocean. So please find out the name of this Chinese-built port in Myanmar, which is just few kilometers away from Sittwe, and mention the name of the port in the comments below. Coming to another article on page number 9. The article is referring to a tribal community in Chhattisgarh, right? It's referring to a tribe called the Murua tribe. It's also referring to some important topics like Salwa, Judum, Dandakaranya region, which is linked with left-wing extremism or Naxalism. So there are some important points that we can take away from here for our prelims. So let's understand something about the Murua tribe. The Murua represent an indigenous community found in the Bastar region of Chhattisgarh. They inhabit the Dandakaranya region. Dandakaranya is a reference to a dense forested area centered around Chhattisgarh. Historically, it was a reference to the forested areas of Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, and Andhra Pradesh. But in modern times, it's a reference to the dense forested areas, the tribal belt of Chhattisgarh, which is centered around the Bastar district, which is a hub of left-wing extremism. So this is where you find an indigenous community called the Murua, right? They are categorized as Adivasis. They've been given the scheduled tribe status, and they are part of the Gondi people. They belong to the Dravidian lineage. It's a Dravidian tribal community, part of the Gondi tribe, which is a much broader ethnic group. Now there's something very unique about the Murua. They are known for their very progressive approach towards sexual relations between a man and a woman. Starting right from adolescent years, they encourage premarital sex, right? And they have a very unique societal structure, which makes the tribe quite unique and different, right? And because of the threat of Naxalism, since Naxals have prevailed here, they have destabilized this whole region. Several members of the Murua tribe have been displaced, and they have relocated to Telangana and Andhra Pradesh and Odisha as well. Is that clear? So essentially, the Murua tribe have been at the receiving end of left-wing extremism. So one issue that the article is flagging is Salwa Judum. So what is Salwa Judum? Salwa Judum was a private militia that was sponsored by the Chhattisgarh state government in order to tackle Naxalism. Another tribe called the Kond and the Koya, they were supported by the Chhattisgarh state police. They were given arms and they were given incentives to hunt Naxals. Essentially, the state government of Chhattisgarh was involved in backing a private militia, an armed militia. It was started by a local politician initially. Later, it received backing from the state government and the state police. So this became very controversial because in a constitutional democracy, you can't have private militias backed by the state and you can't use them against insurgency or terrorism. That is the job of the state forces, which are accountable, right? But a private militia is not answerable to anyone. It's not accountable. So there were many cases of human rights violations reported under the atrocities committed by Salwa Judum. Right? Salwa Judum would be this private militia of the Koya tribe primarily. They were even called Koya commandos. They were given a tag as well, like special police officers. They would get rewards if they kill Naxals. In many cases, they would just kill their rivals or an innocent person and brand them as a Naxal just to get rewards and promotions. So this had become a deadly practice in Chhattisgarh, and eventually it was struck down by the Supreme Court. In 2011, in a historic judgment in the Nandini Sundar case, Nandini Sundar, who is a social activist, fought a historic legal battle at the Supreme Court, and in the Nandini Sundar case in 2011, the Supreme Court struck down Salwa Judum as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court stated that governments cannot back private militias in a constitutional democracy. So since then, Salwa Judum has been disbanded. Now coming to the last article on page number 11, India is exploring copper and cobalt deposits from Congo, from the African country of Congo, that is DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Because see, both copper and cobalt, they are classified as critical minerals. They are classified as critical minerals. Copper finds many applications, be it in electrical wiring, in wind turbines, in various electrical components. It finds several critical applications. It is a critical resource, right? And India doesn't have enough copper reserves left. So it has many civilian applications and also military applications, from space to defense to aerospace, etc. So this is one critical mineral that we need, along with cobalt. Cobalt is another critical mineral primarily needed for your EV batteries. The lithium-ion batteries, which will power the electric vehicles, right? Or nickel cobalt batteries, but in particular, which can power your electric vehicles. They require cobalt. Just like lithium is a critical resource for lithium-ion batteries, cobalt is very much needed for these EV batteries. So India is looking out for such critical resources because we don't have sufficient reserves. And Congo is one focus country for India. So India is on the verge of signing an agreement. The Ministry of Mines is about to sign a memorandum of understanding with the DRC government to secure exploration rights and mining rights in Congo to ensure that we get access to copper and cobalt reserves. Now please note that DRC is currently going through a civil war. There is a conflict which is raging over here. There is a rebel group. There is a rebel group which is involved in a war, a civil war against the government of Congo. So this is a matter of concern. Now please find out which is this rebel group. I've discussed that in one of the previous sessions. I mentioned the name of this rebel group in DRC, which is leading an ethnic civil war in this region. Is that clear? So also note down the name of this belt, the copper cobalt belt of DRC. It might be asked as a prelims question. It's called the Kolwezi Lubumbashi belt. It is this region of DRC present along the Lualaba River, which is a known reserve for copper and cobalt deposits. This is what India is eyeing. There are other countries interested as well, from Russia to US to China. They are all major players in competing for these critical resources. And India is also a part of this competition. And we are looking to sign an agreement with DRC to get access to the copper and cobalt reserves. So that is the end of today's discussion. So please take down these two questions for your answer writing practice. It's all based on what we have already discussed. So use the same points, build a good structure and write an answer to these questions. And you can post the answers in the comment section below. So with this, I would like to conclude the discussion for today. I hope you guys have liked the session and understood everything. If you did, please let me know in the comments. Do press the like button and without fail, subscribe to our channel. That is it for today. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.